gang, what's up? Just Aaron, right here, Question Period Canada. Oh my goodness, do we have something really fun to show to this episode? We're pretty pumped up. This is the Oggo Committee investigation. Brock, Barrett, they dominate this thing. CBSA does not look good. All the liberals are panicking. They're running and hiding, it would seem, from some kind of cover-up. I don't know what it seems like. You judge for yourself. Let's take a look. This is a wild committee meeting. Like, whoa. This testimony is hard to get honest answers from. Brock does not stop. Barrett is right there, and we'll get answers. Let's see.
I have to make this point of order, but it has to do with the procedure. Future surprise meetings out of the blue, like those this week. Good. Well, that was more of a political statement you just made.
I did the courtesy of having the clerk instruct everyone about these meetings. Plus, the work plan, of course, came today. But before that, there was notice of the meeting that came out both the end of last week.
Point of order, Mr. Chair.
Ms. Khalid, I'm addressing a point of order right now, so why don't you just hold on a second, and I'll finish up with Ms. Shanahan and then hear your point of order. I will, Ms. Khalid, ask you to, when I turn to you, it will be a point of order. I'm going to address this just once, and then we can deal with it later if you like. But Ms. Shanahan, there was the work plan, of course, is not a notice. We had a subcommittee meeting on this. Your representative on that subcommittee, of course, was welcome to brief you on what was discussed. And I've sent Ms. Yip a note today if we can talk about it tomorrow or wait till next week. The preference is to wait until next week. Ms. Khalid, you have a point of order, please.
Calling Ms. Brenta's concerns to be political in nature. I think that we have worked very well in this committee in the past in bringing consensus, in working through the issues. We are a nonpartisan or a multi-partisan committee. And for you to make those objections, Chair, is...
Thank you. Ms. Khalid, all committees
fair.
are...
No, sorry, Chair, I'm not done.
This is not a point of order, Ms. Khalid. Ms. Khalid, this is, again, a statement. All committees are multi-partisan. This is one that is also opposition-led. We had a subcommittee meeting on this, and I gave everyone what I thought to be suitable notice and received no objections beforehand. I am now on the floor, which is disrupting the meeting. This is not a point of order. And so I'm going to move on. You'll be in a position to make a further statement when it is your time. But again, my email works when I'm not in committee as well, and members are of course welcome to either work through me or work through their representative on the subcommittee. But the idea, to Ms. Shanahan's point, that today's working calendar represents the first that anyone heard of this. Is false. There was both an unofficial notice that was given a week ago, as well as official notification the end of last week, and then yesterday as well.
Point of order, Chair. My intervention was more that I hope that we will now follow the work plan and the subcommittee discussions, and that we will have no more meetings that are unilaterally called by the chair.
Well, Chair, if we're just offering points of order, Chair, I'd like to make a point of order that I hope that we don't have points of order that aren't actually points of order like those from the previous two
Barrett.
interveners.
I was taking Ms. Shanahan's last comment as a bow on her previous comment, and we will now, I will continue the opening process, welcoming our witnesses, and then we'll get to, the rounds of questioning. And just for the record, for everyone, the indication I have is that we will review the subcommittee work Tuesday at the end of the meeting is the preference from members. So without further ado, today's meeting is taking place in hybrid format. Pursuant to the standing orders, members are attending in person in the room and remotely using the Zoom application. A reminder that all comments should be addressed to the chair. Contrairement à l'article 108.3G du règlement, le comité...
Pursuant to Standing Order 108.3G, the committee shall resume its study of Arrivecan Report 1.
From the Office of the Auditor General, Andrew Hayes, Deputy Auditor General, Sami Hanouch, Principal, Lucie Després, Director. And from the Canadian Border Services Agency, Darryl Vleeming, Vice President and Chief Information Officer, and Jonathan Moore, Vice President, controllership brands. Mr. Hayes, you'll be given up to 5 minutes for your opening remarks, and then we'll turn to CBSA. So without further ado, you have the floor, Mr. Hayes. Do you have a timer by chance?
Mr. Chair, thank you for inviting us again to discuss our report on Arrivecan. I would like to acknowledge that this hearing is taking place on the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. I am accompanied by Sammy Hanush and Lucy Dupré, who were responsible for the audit. Dans le cadre de notre audit de l'application Arrivecan,
our audit of the Arrivecan application looked at how the Canada Border Services Agency, the Public Health Agency of Canada, and Public Services and Procurement Canada managed the procurement and development of the application, and whether they spent public funds in a way that delivered value for money.
you have heard the Auditor General emphasize how deeply concerned we are by what this audit didn't find. We didn't find records to accurately show how much was spent on what, who did the work, or how and why contracting decisions were made. And that paper trail should have existed. Overall, this audit shows a glaring disregard for basic management and contracting practices throughout Arrivecan's development and implementation. Government organizations needed to be flexible and fast in responding to the COVID-19 pandemic, but they still needed to document their decisions and demonstrate the prudent use of public funds. In this audit, we found disappointing failures and omissions everywhere we looked. Public servants must always be transparent and accountable to Canadians for their use of public funds. An emergency does not mean that all the rules go out the window and that departments and agencies are no longer required to document their decisions and keep complete and accurate records. Monsieur le Président, je termine ainsi.
Mr. Chairperson, we'd be pleased to answer any questions, and I conclude my opening remarks. Thank you very much.
Mr. Moore, I understand you have an opening statement. 5 minutes, please.
Good morning, Mr. Chair and honourable members of the committee. I'd like to thank the Auditor General and the Procurement Ombudsman for their reports, which have identified some important lessons for us all. The Canada Border Services Agency has already implemented a number of actions to address their recommendations. At the onset of the pandemic, the CBSA was focused on protecting our borders while maintaining the flow of essential travellers and trade. The agency needed to adapt its operations at a time of considerable uncertainty over the health risks. The need for Arrivecan arose quickly when it became clear that the manual, paper-based processes for tracking the contact tracing and health information of travellers did not meet the needs of the Public Health Agency of Canada. FAC asked the CBSA to assist them by developing a digital form, and the first version of Arrivecan was released 6 weeks later. Over the following 2.5 years, the CBSA responded to the changing health requirements, set out in over 80 orders in council, by releasing 177 different versions of the app. The agency has estimated that the border health measures related to the Arrivecan app cost $55 million, including a number of non-IT costs, such as over $6 million for the Service Canada call centre. The Auditor General and the Procurement Ombudsman reports have identified a number of very serious weaknesses in procurement and internal controls processes. We have accepted their recommendations, and our management response plans are already underway. I would like to highlight a few of those actions aimed at strengthening the agency's governance and assurance functions. We have strengthened the first line of defence by requiring all HQ staff with financial delegations to retake 4 procurement training courses to help them better understand their responsibilities. Given the weaknesses in procurement oversight, we have established a new Executive Procurement Review Committee to strengthen the second line of defence by reviewing all contracts and task authorisations over $40,000. We have also established a new Procurement Centre of Expertise, which is developing an ongoing programme of quality assurance reviews to ensure compliance with the directive, with a particular focus on the need for proper record keeping. Our management response plans are aligned with the plans of other government departments, as developing the Arrivecan app was a shared responsibility. The agency leveraged PSBC's contracting authorities for over 30 of those contracts and shared Services Canada for 7 contracts. The CBSA was the contracting authority for the remaining 4 contracts. In the first year, the agency was responsible for managing the development, enhancement and operations of the Arrivecan app on behalf of FAC. However, no new funding was received in the 2020-2021 financial year, and the costs were coded to a general COVID-19 pandemic measures account, which would have included other pandemic-related expenditures like personal protective equipment and cleaning. The agency did establish a dedicated financial code in the second year, when funding was provided by FAC and the Immigration, Refugees and Citizenship Canada. And in hindsight, this should have been created much earlier. I am very proud of my employees, colleagues and frontline border services officers who served Canada throughout the pandemic. We acknowledge the very serious deficiencies and welcome the lessons learned. We are now focused on addressing the recommendations that have already been made. We would be pleased to answer your questions. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much. Beginning our first round of questions now, Mr. Brock, you have the floor for 6 minutes.
Chair, and good morning, and thank you for all the witnesses for your attendance today. First line of questioning will be to the Auditor General team. Anyone can answer it. But a couple of weeks ago, mid-March, we heard from both Darren Anthony and Christian Firth, the 2 principal owners of GC Strategies, also known as Government of Canada Strategies, who picked apart the findings in the Auditor General's report. Specifically, Mr. Firth said his reputation had been damaged by false information and what he called an inaccurate report by the AG. Quoted, "Virtually everything reported about my company in the media and stated about me and my company has been false." He said his company was paid $11 million for the Arrivecan, disputing the Auditor General's findings that GC Strategies received almost double that, $19 million. He blamed the discrepancy on flaws in the government's financial systems. We then heard from his partner Darren Anthony and surprisingly simply parroted everything that his partner had said, didn't even take the time to actually read your report, didn't take the time to read the report of the procurement ombudsman, but had no problem stating that everything was categorically false. Specifically, he said the Auditor General's findings were inaccurate. He says that the report from both AG and procurement ombudsman which found both serious problems with Arrivecan contracts were wrong, and admitted again that he had not read the report. So I'm sure this is not the first time the AG team has learned about these particular statements. I'd like an opportunity for you to respond on how you feel about these particular statements.
Thank you for the question. I'll start with the findings. We're confident with the findings that we provided to Parliament in our reports. We have a rigorous audit process to make sure that the facts and information that we provide is accurate. With respect to the estimates, we did provide an estimate in the report around the overall cost, and we identified an amount per contractor. There are some facts that absolutely cannot be disputed. In particular, it is a fact that the contractors were paid the amounts that we listed in our report. I should say that they received at least those amounts. Some contractors received more. What is really at issue is whether or not those amounts should be attributed to the Arrivecan app versus work on another IT project. And this is where the poor record keeping problems by CBSA raise this confusion and leave these open questions. Ultimately, in our report, we mentioned that the poor record keeping led us to have to build up an estimate. We used the CBSA's financial systems, the contracting documents, and other evidence to build up this estimate. It is important to remember that our estimate includes more than what was spent on building the app. It also includes amounts for the implementation, maintenance, and other associated costs. And this is because Parliament asked us to look at all aspects of the Arrivecan app. The shortcomings in the documentation and the weak controls made it very difficult to precisely attribute costs amongst these elements of Arrivecan. But ultimately, any number that is provided, whether it's CBSA's or ours, is an estimate because of the poor record keeping. I'll stop there.
Okay, so let me understand that correctly. The 19 million, the approximate 19 million you attribute to GC strategies. Are you saying that there is room to interpret that as being a combination of Arrivecan contracting and possibly other elements of contracting with the CBSA?
Yes, in our report, we did state that it is possible that some amounts attributed to Arrivecan were not for the application. And indeed, when CBSA provided information to the Government Operations Committee, there were some amounts in the records that they produced there that we didn't consider to be for Arrivecan, and there were amounts that we have considered to be for Arrivecan that CBSA disagrees with. Ultimately, though, we were confident enough with our estimate to put it in a report to Parliament.
Were you confident enough to say that that estimate could have been actually higher than 19 million?
It could have been higher and it could have been lower. I can't
Okay.
I can't be precise. I mean, it is an estimate after all.
Okay. Notwithstanding the comments of both Firth and Anthony at committee several weeks after the release of the AG report, did you hear directly from Firth or Anthony prior to their testimony?
Prior to their testimony, we received a letter from them before we tabled our report.
Did they supply you with any additional documentation to verify their numbers, which were actually closer to 11 million?
Like I said, we received the letter. We built our estimate on the basis of the documentation and the financial system at CBSA, amongst other evidence.
But did they offer to supply you documentation in their possession, which established the 11 million figure according to their records?
In their letter, they did offer to provide us information if we required it. However, I would say that like I said, our estimate was based on not just what semantically some contractors are suggesting was the build for Arrivecan, it was for the entire picture of Arrivecan.
Thank you, Mr. Brock. That is your time. Next up, Ms. Khalid, joining us virtually. You have the floor, please.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you to the witnesses for appearing today. Mr. Moore, you had said in your opening remarks about lessons learned. Well, those lessons have cost taxpayers millions of dollars, including, like the behavior of bureaucrats, including conservative insiders like David Yao and from Dalian. So perhaps we can take a step back and try to understand what exactly happened here. And how we can make sure that the public service is accountable to Canadians with this very important issue. So can you please perhaps help us explain the function of what comptrollership branch at Canada Border Service Agency really does?
So very happy to explain. So I was not personally responsible for Arrivecan, but as a member of the CBSA's Executive Committee, I am accountable for the failures, and we have already taken note of those failures, and we've already started to deal with them. In terms of Arrivecan, it was managed by the Border Task Force, and actually the controllership branch was mainly focused on managing the internal task force during the COVID pandemic. These were very, very difficult times. This was a time where people were crossing the border to return back to Canada, when we were told that we could catch COVID from touching documents. So our number one priority initially, working with FAC, was to get the form up and running. That cost about $80,000. The controllership branch involvement in this one was really around making sure we had the funding available for that. And we recognise the comments made by the Auditor General, and in year one we did not have an accounting code. And so we were not identifying the Arrivecan cost separately. That is one of the reasons why we have different cost estimates included in the numbers. And in fact, actually, that's also recognised in the OAG report itself in paragraph 1.24, which does identify that $53 million was the estimate for the OAG for the public health component, with a further $6.2 million included for the customs declaration. But we recognise that, in year one, we did not have the information available to us, and so it was estimates in both cases. So that was our primary role in terms of the first year we were looking after the finances, but we were also working extensively on the internal task force.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Now, you had said that you were not personally involved in the development of the Arrivecan app, but perhaps you can provide us with a high-level overview of what kind of lessons that or topics that are covered in the mandatory retraining of staff at the CBSA as part of your response to the Auditor General's report.
So I think the first thing I would say is we have to look at the 2 or 3 lines of defence. So the first line of defence is based within the Information Science and Technologies branch. They were responsible for the Arrivecan app, for the development and operations of that application. We have over 1,600 delegated financial officers within the agency. Around about 900 of those are based in headquarters. Quite a large number of those individuals are based in the Border Technologies and Innovation Directorate, which was directly responsible for the development of the app and also for the contracting functions working with PSPC. So what we were doing there is looking at the failures of the first line of defence. And we have no doubt there were failures in the first line of defence in terms of governance, in terms of oversight, in terms of record keeping. And all of those things are lessons we have learned. They're also potentially, well, subject to the investigations to look at whether there was any wrongdoing in some of those failures. We recognise that there were failures. We're not entirely sure exactly what the reason for those failures, whether they were because of the stress of the pandemic or whether there was any wrongdoing included in that. And we should wait for the investigations to conclude on that matter. The second line of defence is where the controllership branch is involved. And what we do every year, we take a sample of about 5,000 non-pay transactions and we look to see if they're being properly processed. On average, we find around about 9 to 10% of errors. That is not satisfactory to us. Our target is less than 5%. We were very disappointed to see the Auditor General's report, which identified 18% of those errors. We are looking into the reasons for that, and some of those reasons are because there wasn't a separate cost centre code. So there was an administrative error in that the individual invoices were not being coded to the right account because we didn't have that separate code. So those were really the basic functions of the first line and the second line of defence.
Thank you, Mr. Moore. And to Mr. Hayes. Mr. Hayes, are there any lessons learned here with respect to contracting within your own office with all of this coming to light?
Thank you. We take the contracting responsibilities at our office very seriously. We are rigorous with our contracting. What we have learned though from this audit and implemented in our office is more awareness around conflict of interest declarations, and I would say also increasing the awareness for all of our managers of the importance of making sure that documentation is kept in a very, very accurate way.
And so you've taken concrete steps going forward with respect to conflict of interest in your office?
Yes, we have. Indeed, we always do have an annual process for conflict of interest declarations. We have increased some of that awareness work that we do by sending out reminders to our staff, by raising with staff the fact that the clerk has issued a report on values and ethics in the public service, and there is training available for our staff that we always encourage.
Et voilà, merci beaucoup. Suivant, c'est Madame.
That's it. Ms. Cycle-Desgagnés, please, you have the floor for 6 minutes, please. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairperson. I'd also like to ask questions of Mr. Moore to begin with. Mr. Moore, your title, Controllership Director, you've held that title since 2018, in fact, and you were responsible for the internal control of the CBSA, whilst everything that occurred between 2020, 2021, the awarding of contracts, etc., during that whole time, do you think that you did your job well, or did you even do your job at all? Thank you very much for your question.
I do believe I did my job well during the pandemic. It was a very difficult period in time. I was appointed in January of 2018, so I was there for the entirety of the pandemic. It was a very challenging time for the agency as a whole. As I have said previously, I was responsible for the internal task force, which was primarily based on our employees, making sure they have PPE available to them, making sure that we were managing the work from home directive and managing all of the internal functions of the agency. I was not directly responsible for the border task force. However, I did have oversight in terms of the finances. As I said before, I was responsible for ensuring we had sufficient funding to manage the border task force activities, and I was also responsible for the second line of defence, as I previously described. So I'm very proud of what we did during the pandemic. I know we made mistakes, and I know we've learnt lessons from those mistakes, but they were mistakes in the context of an operational crisis for us, with people coming across the border where we had to manage.
Monsieur.
Mr. Moore, all the countries across the world had to deal with that crisis, and very few of them forked out $60 million for an app like Arrivecan. Now, in some countries, self-respecting countries, there are internal control mechanisms, especially in important services like the Canada Border Services Agency, who do their job and avoid these kinds of occurrences where there are non-competitive contracts that are awarded to companies of two individuals. There are internal control mechanisms across many countries, and you used the term oversight, that you play a supervisory role in all of that. And given that you did have an oversight role, you are accountable. You are accountable to taxpayers who've paid far too much for this app. Moreover, your signature can be found on a letter that was sent in the spring of 2020 stating that GC Strategies absolutely needed to get a contract for a duration of 3 years, but you also said that the emergency exception or carve-out should be applied. Now, that's a problem. If it's urgent, well, you don't fork out $3 million or millions of dollars over a short period. Yes, you issue a contract in short order, but a contract of a small amount. So how is it that you were responsible for financial control, and yet you sent out a letter for an emergency exception to be applied, whereas Mr. Bunatuno's advice was to have a 3-year contract for millions of dollars, which was way above and beyond what the app was supposed to cost at the outset. How do you justify that you signed that letter in May 2020?
So I think there were a number of different questions in there. We do not have details about other countries, but we do understand there were also significant costs involved in managing travellers across borders in other countries, in particular in the Border 5 and the European Union. But I want to just come back to the National Security Exemption Letter. I recognise that I did sign that in June of 2020, and that was at the request of PSBC to allow them to put in place the second contract for GC Strategies. They had already done the first contract for GC Strategies in I think it was in March, but they needed to do the second contract. And I referred at the Oggo committee last week to the comments around we identified a supplier that was successfully implemented a modern tool for risk assessment. As I identified last week, that was a company called Lixar. What I have learned since last week was actually Lixar was working in strategic partnership with GC Strategies. And so I accept that, that the testimony of the PSBC Deputy Minister was correct in that this letter directly led to the second contract for GC Strategies. So that is what the National Security Letter was used for. Only one contract was let under that National Security Exemption Letter. The others were let under the FAC originated National Security Exemption Letter.
Mais pourtant, dans une lettre...
And yet, in a letter that was shared with the committee, you insist that GC Strategies, you insisted that that company should be used on the basis of that exemption. You insisted that that company would receive millions of dollars, even though it was indeed for the second contract. What was the amount of that second contract? Do you have that information at your disposal? The second contract awarded to GC Strategies, please.
So I do, but I also would just like to say that I did not in that letter insist on GC Strategies. That was a decision made by the Border Technologies and Innovation Directorate. I was not aware of their name. And actually, in the letter, it does not mention a name of an individual company.
Non, mais vous mentionnez que pour des raisons de sécurité, il faut...
No, but you stated for security reasons a contract needed to be issued very quickly, and it was the second contract. You just confirmed that, didn't you?
I agree. So there were 3 contracts in total issued by PSPC, all through a sole source agreement under cover of a national security exemption. The second one was issued with an initial value of $4.4 million. Total expenditures after contract amendments amounted to 11.1 million.
Vous trouvez normal d'octroyer...
Do you think that it's normal? Thank you very much, ma'am. Unfortunately, your time's run out. I apologize. Next up, Mr. Desjardins.
For 6 minutes, please. You're joining us virtually. Over to you, Mr. Desjardins.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and I want to thank the witnesses for being present with us today. It is a troubling fact that Arrivecan has cost Canadians millions and millions of dollars while we're experiencing a cost of living crisis. Canadians, whether they're paying rent or just trying to pay their bills, are seeing things go up and getting more expensive. At the same time, it's troubling that their government is spending, without seeming care or oversight, expensive and extreme outsourced contracts. And this is, I think, the crux of my concern, and one that I'll focus on in my questions to our witnesses. We know that, for example, from our statements from the union representatives at CBSA, that there's a double crisis that's happening right now. The crisis of the dramatic underfunding of our public service that has largely created a vulnerability to which CBSA has been forced, in some sense, to outsource, looking for the expertise that they don't have. The other problem is when CBSA is given that longer leash, it seems as though things get way out of hand. We see multiple breaches of very basic levels of accounting, of reporting, and I'd argue of basic ethics to be able to even disclose facts of when or how or if there was influence by private contractors and preferred access to private contractors, particularly when we look at the evidence that the Auditor General has found. I want to turn to finding 1.28 in the report for us to look at. It quotes, the Canadian Border Service Agency determined that it would need to rely on external resources to develop the web-based and mobile application because it did not have sufficient internal capacity with the skills needed. We know that since 2006, as early as then, there's this rapid increase in outsourced contracts by the Government of Canada. We see that in instances like the Phoenix Pay System, where we give a contract from the government, it gets out of control, and these private contractors then endlessly bill the taxpayer for, in this case, even task authorizations that were not completed. Basic levels of mistrust, I think, that were breached here. In addition, finding 1.29, the Auditor General found that as time went on, the agency continued to rely heavily on external resources. You can see Exhibit 1.2. Reduced reliance on external resources would have decreased the total cost of the application and enhanced value for money. This is, I think, the most important piece to some of this work, to know that at a time when you could have reassessed some of the task authorizations, even if the task authorization had information relevant to what they were doing or who was doing it, there would have been an opportunity to reduce the overall cost of some of this work. You can look, for example, on that exhibit submitted by the Auditor General's Office of the tremendous cost that this bears against the public. It's now, I think, incredibly important that the checks and balances you mentioned at the onset of your testimony, Mr. Moore, aren't only just listened to today in this committee, but are actually enforced, because I often find in this committee we have officials such as yourself who, in this particular instance, we see a massive breach of public trust. The attempt to rebuild that public trust is often words and recommendations put forward by the Auditor General. But what I find troubling is sometimes these recommendations don't fully meet where they're target or not enforced. And that's troubling for me. So I'm going to be requesting at the end of our meeting that we investigate follow-up opportunities for your appearance here and follow up on some of the recommendation enforcement, because the enforcement aspect of this is important to me, because it has to change. This just can't continue the way it is. I'm nervous that this could be going on in other ministries or even continuing in your ministry if we don't continue to see some of these checks and balances properly addressed and fully implemented. It's true that we know CBSA has also, you just mentioned, Mr. Moore, was approached by the Public Service and Procurement Canada during an instance of the second contract when they reviewed the first set of contracts and determined that they were insufficient for the purposes of being competitive because of their non-competitive nature and recommended a competitive process. Is it your letter that you just submitted or that you admitted that was signed in May of 2020? Is it the case that was that your response to the initial inquiry by Public Service and Procurement Canada? Mr. Moore.
So actually, I signed the national security exemption on the 1st of June 2020. It was not in response because those comments received from PSPC were sent directly to the Information Science and Technologies branch. They did not come to the CFO's branch. And so we were not aware of any of that feedback from PSPC at the time. It was being sent to the Border Technologies and Innovation Directorate. In terms of
considering that PSAC understood the nature of how non-competitive contracts could be abused, why is it that you weren't able to do such a thing?
We were not aware. We were only aware of that during these inquiries. So at the time, they were engaging directly with the Information Science and Technology branch. That has now been stopped. So what part of our procurement improvement plan is that all contracting has to go through our procurement directorate, which is within the controllership branch.
And why wasn't that the case prior to this and for so long?
I think it was because we were taking reliance on our other government department partners, especially during a very busy time for all of us. So as I said previously in my introductory, over 30 of the contracts for Arrivecan were actually, the contract authority was PSPC, and there is a service level agreement between CBSA and PSPC, which sets out the requirements of CBSA as the technical authority and PSPC as the contract authority.
And thank you. I'm afraid that is the time, Mr. Desjardins. We will, of course, be back to you shortly. Beginning our second round, Mr. Barrett, you have the floor for 5 minutes, please.
Mr. Vleeming, on GC Strategies' now deleted website, they had a number of testimonials from senior government officials. In one case, the Government of Canada Chief Information Officer was quoted as saying, quote, GC Strategies understands our needs on a business and technical level, end quote. Who would have said that?
Thank you for the question. I've only been at the CBSA for 11 months, so I was not CIO at the time. Prior to me, Min Doan was CIO over the last, I think, 5 years.
Has anyone asked Mr. Doan if that was him?
I am not aware of that.
Who else could it have been? So we've established it wasn't you?
If the reference was specifically to who was the Chief Information Officer of the CBSA in the last 5 years, that would have been Min Doan.
Okay, but it wasn't you that said it?
That's correct.
Are you aware that it was said?
I am
or alleged to have been said? You're not familiar?
All I've heard is the testimony of committees that referencing that certain testimonials on the GC Strategies website.
And did it cause you concern that endorsement had been offered by the
CIO?
CIO?
It surprised me, as you wouldn't typically see that, at least in my experience.
In another example, the Chief Data Officer for the public sector said, quote, GC Strategies, see the bigger picture and do not chase the quick sale. Who would have said that?
I'm not actually aware of who the Chief Data Officer was at the time, sorry.
Has anyone tried to find out who said it?
I'm not part of the internal investigation, which I would assume is also going to be looking at that.
In another case, a Government of Canada senior executive said, quote, GC Strategies listen and try to find solutions to my problems versus selling me a solution to a problem I've never had. Who would have said that?
Not aware of that either.
So we don't know. Could it have been Min Doan?
It's impossible for me to answer that, as there's no details on who actually said that and what their position was.
I'm a bit surprised that even a basic level of curiosity wouldn't have encouraged you to find out if your predecessor, on an unnamed basis, but only using the title that you now have, had actually said something like that, and then now occupying that position would not have sought remediation, that is, for it to be taken down. Did you ask for it to be taken down by GC Strategies?
No, as far as I'm aware, it's certainly not against any rules or laws to put that up there, and I'm not sure the government has the ability to
But you could ask if it's not true. But
again, if it's not against the law, I'm not aware of them violating any rules by putting that up there. It's just not something I would typically expect.
So it's compliant with the values and ethics code for the public service?
As far as I'm aware, that would be compliant with the values and ethics code.
Well, I can tell you if someone who previously held my position said something that I fundamentally disagreed with, and it was attributed in current time by job title only, I'd at least ask the person who had it posted, because I value my reputation and think it's important to the integrity of the institution that I represent that things that are demonstrably false don't continue to stand. I would hope that people who represent in senior positions the government of Canada on behalf of all Canadians would exercise that same basic due diligence, because we have let's be clear, this is a two-person shady company operating out of a basement that get paid tens of millions of dollars, and they're close enough. They're now alleging that they're close enough with the Liberal government senior officials that they're able to provide testimonials. I'm surprised that you'd be unaware that there hasn't been an investigation of that. Have you, sir, or the current CBSA executives had any contact with Christian Firth or Darren Anthony?
I have not met either of those.
Have you had contact with them?
No, never.
No phone calls, emails, text messages?
Nothing at all.
Okay, Mr. Moore, same question.
No, I've had no contact. No, I've had no contact at all with TC Strategies or any of their employees.
Do you know when the last contact with the person that previously occupied your position, Mr. Fleming, when Mindone would have last contacted them?
I'm not aware of that specific date, no.
Mr. Moore, are you aware of their last contact with the agency?
No, but I know that we ceased paying them in June of 2023.
In June of 2023?
That's right.
Right. Nearly a year after concerns had been brought to the attention of CBSA
Question, Mr.
through
Barrett.
the work of Conservatives at standing committees of Parliament. I have more questions for Lee.
Thank you. Sorry to interrupt. Just want to make sure you got it under the wire. Next up, Ms. Yip, you have the floor for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you. Thank you for coming today. My question is for Mr. Moore or Mr. Vielming. Did I pronounce that right? Thank you. For the benefits of Canadians watching, can you explain what staff augmentation is?
So I'd be very happy to start, and maybe Darryl can take over. So staff augmentation is when an organization decides to build something in-house but doesn't have all of the skills required to do that. And so staff augmentation is when you bring in contractors, often on a day rate or sometimes on a rate for a fixed product. And staff augmentation is widespread throughout the Government of Canada. And if I go back to the Deputy Minister of DND's testimony to this committee, he identified that actually it was a necessity to have staff augmentation because sometimes it's not very easy for individual contractors to get contracts with the Government of Canada. It requires an awful lot of work to actually secure those contracts. So going through a staff augmentation specialist does add value to those individuals, small and medium-sized enterprises. Also, hiring in the public service is not very easy. And I think in particular for issues like sort of technical architects, cloud architects, there was not enough in the Government of Canada. I think the previous CIO talked about sort of 25-30% shortfall in the number of people who are in-house. So we are trying to increase the number of people in-house, but it's not easy to get it. Also, the skill set may not be value for money for the public sector. If you have a very technical specialist, we may not have sufficient work for them to do over a long period of time. And also for short-term assignments and projects, they're very important. So staff augmentation has its purpose. I think PSBC gave evidence that there's over 600 different companies which are actually providing staff augmentation. The issue here is how we used it. And we definitely agree that we used it too much and we used it for too long. And maybe I'll hand over to Mr. Vleeming now to talk a bit about what we're trying to do to reduce the requirement.
Yeah, certainly we've drastically reduced the number of contractors. In the 11 months I've been here, we've gone down over 25%. And we're on target for the end of this next fiscal to drop down probably another 25%. To Mr. Moore's point, staff augmentation is well used in government and in private sector as well, but it has to be used in the right way. So It needs to be used for surge capacity when you don't have the staff. It shouldn't be the case where contractors are around for years and years and years, because then there's other methods that should be used, like training your existing staff, so you don't become reliant on those contractors.
Thank you. Could you give an example of what type of contractors you are using that would provide value for money?
It typically is around the cutting edge technology, including what was Arrivecan was built on. So if you think about modern cloud applications that are using very cutting edge tools, often the in-house staff doesn't have those skills. But what should occur is contractors should be brought in for a specific initiative on those skill sets, but then they should also be used to cross-train your existing staff. That then allows your existing staff to take over going forward, and you don't become reliant on those contractors. And so our approach going forward is to take that sort of scenario versus becoming reliant on them. And that's how we'll be able to reduce our long-term reliance on those contractors.
Could you tell me a bit about the Executive Procurement Review Committee? What are their responsibilities? What is this committee all about?
So maybe if I'll take that. So I established the Executive Procurement Review Committee last October, and this is to address many of the high findings in the OAG report, but also in the Procurement Ombudsman report. This is to deal with the second line of defence, which was clearly lacking during the COVID period for us. So now the Executive Procurement Review Committee looks at every single contract and every single task authorization above $40,000. We have about 1,500 contracts across the CBSA, so that's a significant requirement. But this is about ensuring that we do make this change stick. We do make sure that this applies across the agency as a whole. And maybe in time, if we start to see performance improving, we could raise those limits. So we've had over a dozen meetings of this. It meets on average at least once a week. And we go through all of these different proposals. And in the case of Mr. Vleeming's branch, a presentation will be made to the committee to say this is what we aim to do, and there will be questions will be asked about is it compliant with the procurement controls and measures. We will ask for procurement directorate to give us assurance that it is completely compliant. So it's there as a second line of defence to ensure this never happens again.
Is this committee permanent or temporary?
It has been established as a permanent committee of the Executive Committee. In an ideal world, if we became absolutely perfect at procurement, then you wouldn't need this committee. But I think actually even in an ideal world, providing that level of additional oversight is always going to be valuable to the agency.
Thank you. And that is your time, Monsieur. Encore une fois, Madame Sinclair-Degagné.
Ms. Sinclair-Degagné, 2.5 minutes, please. Thank you, Mr. Chairperson. I'd like to direct my questions at Mr. Vleeming's, please, now. Mr. Vleeming, you've been in your position for about 11 months, is that correct? Now, did you play another role in terms of private companies, aside from what is normally a very busy role of CIO?
Est-ce que vous jouez un autre rôle?
Did you play another role outside your role of CIO, or do you currently do so?
I sit on a charity board and another board, that's all.
L'autre conseil d'administration, vous siégez?
The other board you sit on is a private company called Pillar 9, is that correct?
Oui.
Combien de temps?
Yes. How much time does that take up to provide advice on the board of a private company, please?
It's a very small commitment, probably on average, maybe 5 hours a month.
Considérez-vous que vous avez...
Do you feel that you have enough time to do that, given that you hold a very important position and you need to tidy up house at the CBSA?
Yes, I'm comfortable that I'm able to do both.
D'accord. Et vous considérez pas qu'il y a
I see. And you don't perceive there to be any problem of being on the board of a private company? If I understand it, the company provides data solutions. It's a company that may at some point in time work for the Government of Canada in some way. You don't think that there's a conflict of interest or an appearance of conflict of interest working for such a company on their board?
So what Pillar 9 does is provide the MLS services specifically to realtors in Alberta, so there is no chance it would ever work for the Government of Canada. Secondly, when I joined, I immediately did file a conflict of interest report that went through the proper channels and was ultimately signed off by our president.
Ah, vous avez rempli ça.
Ah, so you did fill out that form. There are a lot of folks that actually don't fill out that infamous form. That's what we heard at the committee last week, in fact. Now, I do have a number of other questions. Just before you became CIO for the CBSA, you were CIO for a company called Aura Cannabis. Is that correct?
Yes, it is.
Aurora Cannabis.
Aura Cannabis. Well, did that company undergo hacking while you were CIO?
Yes, it did in December 25th of 2000, I believe.
Est-ce qu'on a comme information par rapport?
Do we have information? Sorry, Ms. Sikla-Degagne, can he respond to the question at least, please? No? Mr. Desjardins.
2.5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair. I do want to turn now to one of the findings of the Auditor General in relation to information not being found. Finding 1.18 throughout to the findings suggests that financial records were not well maintained by Canada Border Service Agency. The Auditor General's office was unable to determine a precise cost for the Arrivecan application because of poor documentation and weak controls at Canada Border Service Agency. To both Mr. Moore, Mr. Vleming, who's responsible for, within the ministry, who's responsible for financial records?
So under the directive, the Treasury Board Directive on Service and Digital, all employees at all levels are responsible for documenting decisions and activities. So that is a responsibility of everybody who works in the CBSA. Their managers are responsible for ensuring that they meet those requirements, and actually the CIO is responsible for ensuring we have an information management system to allow that to happen. What I would say is during the COVID period, it was more difficult as a result of many people in headquarters having to work from home. But that's not an excuse. I think that's just a recognition that during that period, it was more difficult to maintain those records.
And so you're in your own words, you're saying that everyone in the ministry is responsible. At what point does anyone in the ministry actually raise the alarm bell? Why didn't you, Mr. Moore?
Because, I talked earlier around the delegation of financial signing authorities. Under the delegations, all of these decisions were made by a level below mine. So I would be responsible for signing contracts which are within my own organization.
But Mr. Moore, you just said it's everyone's responsibility, unless you're not in the ministry, to raise an alarm when they see mismanagement or bad practice. In this case, you're saying that you're not responsible because it was below your pay grade. It was below your authorization.
No,
At what point are officials such as yourself and others who are involved directly in Arrivecan, privy to information of Arrivecan, have access to the contracts of Arrivecan, at what point do you actually say, this is unreasonable, this is not, Canadians can't expect this? Non-competitive contracts that have no tax authorizations, and even worse, there are instances where we don't even have information as to the contractors or how much they charged. Mr. Moore, this is serious, and it's something that I can't understand.
I'm going to allow a response. Your time is virtually up.
Please, why aren't you responsible?
I would say it's very serious, and we're taking these recommendations very seriously in our implementation. But I was not responsible, but as the CFO at that time, I was accountable, and I accept that. And that's why we're putting in place all these additional controls and measures.
Thank you very much. Turning now to Mr. Nader, you have the floor for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and again, thank you to our witnesses for joining us here this morning. At a recent public accounts meeting, Danny Richard, president of the Canadian Financial Officers, testified that between the three departments in question here, there are over 1,000 members in those departments, including 5 members who flagged issues with management. But we understand that very few, perhaps a dozen of these financial officers were actually involved in this procurement process. Mr. Moore, are you concerned by this?
So I'm concerned by a number of the points Mr. Richard made, and I do regularly communicate with him. And I want to identify what more we can do to actually improve the financial manager organisation within the within CBSA. But, sort of where we are in terms of the delegation of financial instruments is the majority of the controls are at the manager level, and we then have financial manager advisors who are engaged in the strategic financial management. They do not sign task authorizations, they do not sign invoices and Section 32 and Section 34 responsibilities. But if they identified wrongdoing or any issues associated with that, they would be responsible for bringing them forward to us.
Well, thankfully, there were problems identified and nothing happened, and I think that's on you, sir. I want to move on, though, but we know there are a number of current investigations ongoing in a number of venues, but most concerning is obviously the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, the RCMP, the Mounties. Our concern here is that Min Doan's emails have magically disappeared. The Chief Technology Officer couldn't save his emails, which is rather concerning, rather than perplexing, and I'm sure the RCMP are very intrigued and interested by that. I want to know from you, Mr. Moore, what are you doing to recover those emails?
So that is subject to an internal investigation and potentially also an RCMP investigation. I'm not privy to either of those investigations, so I can't comment on where they are. In terms of what we are doing to recover those emails, maybe I'll ask Mr. Vleeming to explain.
Thank you. So this is actually being run by our internal investigation as well, including the recovery side of things to ensure there's no conflict of interest. And so I'm not aware of any more information, not privy to that internal investigation.
To you, Mr. Vleeming, how easy is it to permanently delete all your emails without a trace?
It is actually surprisingly easy. The reality is that Shared Services Canada is accountable for email and the policies around that, and a person can choose to delete their emails. It is retained for 30 days where they can't permanently, and after that it is deleted.
Surprisingly easy. I am, quite frankly, shocked by the fact that the Government of Canada, with all the resources of the state behind it, cannot preserve the emails of someone in a position like Min Doan when there is a criminal investigation ongoing and these documents simply disappeared. I think that's incredibly concerning. I want to move on. Mr. Hayes, to you, in your opening comment, you echoed many of the concerns that were previously raised by yourself and by the Auditor General about lack of records, not having paper trails, just things not existing. We received a letter recently from the Department of Public Services and Procurement Canada, the supposed experts on procurement. And the Assistant Deputy Minister wrote this: on February 2nd, 2017, PSPC awarded a contract to GC Strategies for $24,977 through a supply arrangement for professional services to provide business and technical learning to PSPC employees using a new client relationship management system. A search of PSPC systems found references to the contract, including the total amount. However, the contract document itself was misplaced during a reorganization and relocation of hard copy files. So the department supposed to be the experts on procurement is losing documents on procurement and on contracts. What's more, Treasury Board Secretariat, a central agency, wrote to us and said, on behalf of the Treasury Board Secretariat, we have a nil response to expanded motion is provided, nil response to GC Strategies, yet in the Public Accounts of Canada, it lists GC Strategies as having received an account or a contract for the Treasury Board Secretariat. So here we have two key agencies, neither of which can account for their own contracts with GC Strategies. Is that a concern from the Auditor General's office?
We would expect that proper books and records are kept on contracts and on payments made under those contracts for the full period of the retention periods required by law. So obviously there are times where hard copies might be misplaced, and it's important to find them. We've constantly made recommendations and findings about the importance of good record management and accurate data collection. So yes, I would express concern over the fact that contract documents can't be located.
Thank you very much. That is your time, Mr. Nader. Turn now to Ms. Bradford joining us virtually. You have the floor for up to 5 minutes, please, Ms. Bradford.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you for the witnesses for joining us this morning. Getting back to the Executive Procurement Review Committee, who sits on that committee? Mr. Moore?
Very happy to answer that question. So I chaired it for the first 8 meetings, and then it's actually the chair has now been taken over by the Executive Vice President, because the President wanted to demonstrate her commitment to ensuring that we make these changes and implement the recommendations arising from the recommendations in the 2 audit reports. It comprises a number of vice presidents, but it also comprises technical specialists from the Procurement Directorate and a number of other sort of assurance providers, including security and including internal audit. So it's a wide-ranging committee with the mandate to challenge all of the proposals which are coming up and to seek assurance that all of the procurement rules and regulations are being complied with.
What would be the total number of members on the committee?
I think it's getting on for 10 to 12, depending on the numbers who are attending.
And how often do they meet?
Well, as I said earlier, the idea is to have it weekly. I think ultimately it would like to become bi-weekly, but at the moment the volume of activity is requiring a weekly meeting.
And does the committee review all contracts, or how do they decide which ones to look at if they don't look at all of them?
So initially we set a level of $40,000. So below $40,000, we've delegated authority to the Procurement Directorate. Anything above $40,000 for contract or task authorizations has to come to the committee. In addition, at the moment, anything above $1 million has to also go to the whole Executive Committee, which includes the President and the Executive Vice President.
So why was the amount of $40,000 chosen as a threshold?
That was on the advice of the Procurement Directorate, based on the level of risk associated with contracts above and below that limit.
So what would happen if the committee were to have concerns with a contract during one of their reviews? What action would be taken?
So it has already happened a number of times. So normally the action is to go back and ask additional questions, which have to come back with answers. So we have seen some contracts come back to the committee 2 or 3 times, depending on whether all the questions are answered. Ultimately, it's an approval committee. So if it is not approved by the Procurement Review Committee, it will not go ahead.
Now, Mr. Moore, in your opening remarks, you actually mentioned that about $6 million was spent on non-IT costs for Arrivecan. Could you explain what kind of expenses were included in the non-IT amounts?
Well, so $6.1 million was spent with Service Canada, their call centre. So the call centre was set up to take questions from members of the travelling public. They actually managed over 645,000 calls during the period under review. That was for individuals returning to Canada who may have questions around Arrivecan, had questions around the vaccine certification and others. So that was one example of a non-IT related cost. But we do recognise that the majority of these costs were IT related.
Okay, so both Mr. Moore and Mr. Vlaming, have either of you worked with Mindone, Cameron McDonald, or Anthony Utano before?
So I joined the agency, as I said earlier, in January of 2018. Mindone was certainly there at the time, and so I've worked with him as a colleague on the Executive Committee. I had less to do with Cameron McDonald or Mr. Utano because they reported directly to Mindone. But we did see them occasionally at some Executive Committee meetings.
And Mr. Vlaming, what was your interaction with any of these individuals?
I've never worked directly with him at the CBSA. When Mr. Doan was CTO of Canada, I had a number of interactions as relevant to that role.
Okay, could you elaborate on those interactions?
So as Chief Technology Officer, there's a number of monthly meetings with all the CIOs around town that I would have attended as well. And additionally, I did meet with Min shortly after I joined just to get a debrief on the ISTB function at CBSA.
So did either of you have any concerns about their contact with their conduct with the contractors during the early days of the pandemic and during the development of the Arrivecan app?
No,
Either one of you?
I had no concerns, and no concerns were raised at our level. I think just for context of how busy we were during that period, it was all hands on deck. We were working incredibly long hours on a large number of different things. So it was very difficult to establish the same procedures and protocols as we are doing now.
Thank you very much. That is the time. Beginning our third round, Mr. Viersen joining us virtually. You have the floor for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair, and I want to thank the witnesses for being here today. Mr. Moore, presumably your department has emergency planning in place. Would that be the case?
Yes, so we have a standing emergency plan which was utilised during the pandemic. As I've said earlier, we established 3 separate governance committees. We decided to split the operational crisis management committees into 2. The internal task force, which I chaired, and the border task force, which was chaired by the vice president of the Travellers Branch. They both reported to the emergency management committee, which was the executive committee. In the early days, that committee met daily throughout, 24/7 essentially. Over time, that frequency of those meetings started to go down slightly. But it was definitely operating in an emergency management approach across the entire country, because also all of the individual regions were having to manage with a vast change in their approach to how they operated the border. A lot of the ports of entry, certainly the ones which were commercial, were operating incredibly hard, whereas some of the traveller ones actually saw a very big reduction in the volume because of the volumes.
Was this the first time you've experienced
just 1 second,
in your role?
Mr. Viersen, I have a point of order. Yes, Ms. Yep.
I just would like the chair to remind those in the room not to take photos.
Oh.
Thank you.
I did not catch that. You are absolutely correct. There should be no photos. I'm going to have the clerk check with you, Ms. Yip, as to who you spotted, and I will instruct the clerk to have them delete the photo or photos. If you would just check that, I'll keep running the meeting. Thank you, Ms. Yip. Turning now back to Mr. Viersen, you have 3.5 minutes to go, please. Over to you.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Moore, in your time as in your position, is this the first time your department used this emergency planning procedure?
It uses it sadly on 2 regular basis. So, for example, I think a few months ago where there was the tragic accident in the United States around Rainbow Bridge, the Southern Ontario region had to bring in their emergency planning for that, especially during the period when it could have been considered to be a terrorist attack. So any operational activity at the border, we will bring in our emergency management procedures.
Okay, so this is not the first time that this has happened. It seems unique then that there would be a general COVID fund. Was that unique?
So it was unique, but it was also a product of what we were having to do. So, for example, we had to increase the cleaning of our ports of entry and to do it twice a day rather than once a day. We had to secure, with the help of a public health agency and PSPC, all of the PPE. We had to buy sanitization cabinets to allow the officers to actually steam, clean their tools and things like that. So lots of different things.
It was a very broad fund.
It was a very broad fund covering a number of different activities.
Okay, so you would say like a COVID slush fund.
It was definitely not a COVID slush fund. It was an emergency management fund. And in the first year, we provided $5 million to the Information Science and Technology Branch to partially cover their costs of the first year of the Arrivecan app.
From soup to nuts, you could put that in that fund, or it was basically an expense account.
Well, it was an emergency management committee decision. So all decisions went to the emergency management committee, who decided what they were going to be funding with that money.
Okay. What kind of oversight did the minister have of that particular fund?
So the minister had no oversight on that because we were taking this money from our operational funding. So when the minister has oversight when the mains estimates are agreed or when supplementary estimates are agreed, but that would be the only time the minister would have oversight.
would he have known about this COVID slush fund?
He certainly would not. He probably would not have known about the emergency management fund, but I can't comment on whether the president at that time referred to it.
So from protective gloves, masks, cleaning equipment to IT sourcing, that would have all gone through the same funding.
Yes, and in the first year it was about $20 million in total.
And so you can see how the Auditor General would have had a challenge in dissecting this particular slush fund.
Well, I think I do, and I said at the start, we did not have a separate code for all the different activities. It did all go into this fund, and we learned that lesson. That was a mistake. We should have set up separate codes at the start, but I'm afraid that is part of a problem of being able to identify exactly where the funding went to.
Hence, the conclusion that this was a slush fund rather than an emergency management fund. Mr. Chair, I think that's my time. Thank you very much.
That is Mr. Beerson. Thank you very much. Turning now to Ms. Shanahan joining us virtually. You have the floor, Ms. Shanahan. Over to you, please.
Well, thank you very much, Chair, and I too thank the witnesses for appearing here today, and I do appreciate some of the testimony that we heard just prior regarding the Emergency Management Fund. So I'd like to ask Mr. Moore if there's anything that he can add to that, because having a border, one of the largest land borders in my riding, I have many workers, CBSA workers, who live in the riding of Chateauguay-Lacolle, and I know how much they were working during that time and the pressures that they had in addition to their usual duties.
Yes, absolutely.
I'd like to hear more. Yes.
Our priority at all times was the health and safety of our officers at the front line and also our staff in headquarters. So providing them with sufficient PPE to do their job, which at that time was considered to be a very dangerous job. They were meeting people who were returning to the country who may well have had COVID. And as I have said previously, there was a lot of fear about whether they could catch COVID from touching papers. That's one of the main reasons why the Arrivecan app was developed, to allow that information to be given electronically. So definitely, our officers were looking for reassurance, and we provided that reassurance to the best of our ability. We provided it through PPE. As I've said before, we provided it through sanitization cabinets, which weren't available in all ports of entry, but now they're a standard feature in the ports of entry. So we took the health and safety very seriously, and that was all managed through the internal task force.
And Mr. Moore, you mentioned in your opening remarks something to the effect of should have been created earlier. So I just want to clarify, are you talking about the Arrivecan app? Because I know in my travels, including Australia, the electronic border entry app is mandatory and is certainly very critical to the proper management of border entry.
No, I think I was talking about setting up a separate accounting code, but actually the app was developed in just about 6 weeks, which was incredibly fast given the challenges which everyone was facing at the time of COVID. The Auditor General did identify there was an ongoing benefit from the Arrivecan app because it is still used, and in fact I used it yesterday myself, and by using it in airports, about 300,000 people a month do use it, so just over 3.5 million people.
I appreciate that, and I do agree. And with that, Chair, I move that when the committee undertakes to invite witnesses, that a witness list submission deadline be set by the Chair with the explicit consent of the committee, that witnesses be invited proportionately to each recognized party standing in the House, and that no such witness be invited without proper instruction of the committee. Chair, I have that motion that can be delivered to all members forthwith.
Thank you, Ms. Shanahan. Have you delivered it to the clerk in both official languages?
I believe so. Let me just check.
I'm just going to suspend. I'm just going to huddle with the clerk for a second then. But in the meantime, if you could check, please. And I paused the time. Just 1 second, Mr. Desjardins. Mr. Desjardins, I assume you want to speak to this, Mr. Desjardins, or is it a point of order? Yeah, just give me a few minutes.
I guess it's a point of order in relation to just the supply of the motion.
How do you move this? what do you mean by the supplies? And is it coming to you?
Like, did a clerk send us? Yeah.
No, I'm going to check right that. All I have
Oh,
is
I
Shanahan reading it. I'm just going to check right now with the clerk. 1 sec, please. Mr. Viersen, is that a point of order or just lining up?
Just on the motion.
Just 1 sec, please. Thank you, Ms. Shanahan. The clerk's going to send it to members in a few moments. Ms. Shanahan, I'm going to take this as you are tabling this motion. It does not. I'll come back to you in a second. I will allow you to respond. It does not.
Yeah.
It is in the broad category of committee business, which of course is acceptable, but not. Does not pertain to the business at hand with this ongoing meeting. You are welcome to respond to that. We, of course, can pick it up. I am willing to. I am willing to seek additional time on Tuesday if you do. If you're in agreement, but you go ahead, please, Ms. Shanahan.
Chair, I am moving this motion.
So I'm going to move it out of order. It does not. I'll explain why. It does not. It does not pertain to the business at hand. It is a broad motion with respect to how this committee can operate, and of course we could pick it up next week. And as an alternative to members, I propose we finish off today's meeting with witnesses we have, and then we deal with this motion early next week. Ms. Shanahan, you still have 2 minutes.
I challenge that decision, Mr. Chair.
Very good. We'll have a vote then. Clerk, please call the roll call.
Shall the decision of the chair be sustained? Ms. Bradford.
I vote against.
Mr. Van Bynen.
I vote against.
Ms. Khalid.
I vote no.
Ms. Shanahan.
No.
Ms. Yip.
No.
Mr. Nader.
Yes.
Mr. Brock.
Yes.
Mr. Viersen.
Yes.
Madame Sinclair Desgagnés.
Oui.
Mr. Desjardins.
Against.
Five nays, 5 yeas.
So what was that again?
5.
How did Mr. Desjardins vote?
Against.
Mr. Desjardins, can you just confirm your vote? Are you voting to uphold my ruling, or are you voting to have this motion accepted and we will move into debate on this motion?
I'll accept the motion.
So you are moving to debate this motion
Against.
right now?
Yeah.
Very good.
Exactly.
Very good. All right. The committee has overruled the chair, and we are going to debate this motion. Mr. Viersen, you're up first, it looks like. Over to you, please.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. I do recall, I'm a relative new member to this committee, and I do recall the name drop of Mr. Christofferson, of who I had the privilege of serving on committee with in the past, by Ms. Shanahan. And she laid out for me very early on in my time here at this committee that this committee generally operated on a consensus basis, and that it was she was the one that informed me that Mr. Christofferson had said that when this committee was working well, you couldn't tell which party the member was from, or whether the member was an opposition member or a government member. So I find it quite surprising that that this motion is coming from Ms. Shanahan in particular today, that demanding that there would be equal representation of witnesses and based on party allocation and things like that. So I'm surprised. I don't think that that is the spirit of this committee, and I would vote against this motion. So thank you very much, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much. Mr. Desjardins, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And although you know that I
Appel au
appreciate...
règlement, Monsieur le Président.
On a point of order, Mr. Chairperson, just if you could hold on a second, Mr. Desjardins, there's a question, a point of order rather. We haven't received the motion in both official languages yet, so before we debate it, I'd like to get my hands on it.
Meeting until all members have the motion. It was sent to the clerk. I know the clerk is busy working on it, so Mr. Desjardins, if you can just hold for a minute or two, I'll come right back, and I'm going to suspend this meeting. And I do have a list of people that wish to speak to it after you, Mr. Desjardins. I've got.
We watch most of this stuff live, gang, and we have an amazing community that we watch the question periods with. It's super interesting and informative, so come and join us. But also we make these other little videos just to show Canadians what is going on. This is the information, make up your own mind, but come back and watch, because we've got more information to share that's going to help you make up your mind. That's kind of where we're coming from. I'm Aaron, this is Question Period Canada, and boy oh boy do we have questions. Like and subscribe, get notified, share it, do all those fun things. We'll be back with more videos. Come and check out another one. Thank you for watching this one. Till next time, later.